My name's David Young. I'm a member of Boot Brisbane up here in the Cairns region, and with us this evening is Bill Bates, head coordinator of the Boot Brisbane campaign. Good evening, Bill.
Good evening, David.
And with us this evening is a man who needs little introduction. If you know anything about anything when it comes to constitutional law and an opinion generally with anything to do with politics that is received with great respect and admiration, with us this evening is Professor David Flint. Good evening, David.
Good evening, David. And Bill.
Look, thank you very much for taking time out of your evening, as well as what could easily be a busy schedule. And we really appreciate you taking the time to join us just to discuss general things when it comes to our campaign up here to create a new North Queensland state, as well as the general political climate of things. So thank you for coming and thank you for joining us.
Well, it's a very important question. I think you are on an extremely important mission, and this will be significant, not only for North Queensland, but for the whole of Australia. So keep up the good work.
Well, thank you for that, David. Yes, we definitely we don't mind it being a hard slog because we know the cause is just and well, and we know that you're an avid supporter of that. But a couple of people these days are starting to express their opinion based off the current climate and response or lack of response from state governments when it comes to COVID-19. And it's obviously a topic on everybody's minds at the moment, but we've even had somebody like Barnaby Joyce, who is always, as a representative for New England, the only example of a region that's advocated and actually nearly gained, not independence, but statehood for themselves, now turning and saying that the response from COVID-19 by certain states, as well as New South Wales, is a reason to centralise and not create new states. And we've also had recently, I think it's Peter Gleeson on Sky News, also express his dismay for the abolishment of states and that we should just become a centralised two-tier style of government. It's absurd, in my opinion, and many would say that it is. Some support the notion, but look, as a staunch federalist and understanding the way that our country has been constructed and the beauty of the way that it has been constructed, what are your thoughts when you hear that people like Barnaby Joyce have all of a sudden switched mindsets, all because of one example of COVID-19 being mismanaged?
Well, I think it's very unfortunate because there is a significant problem in this country, and I think it's been brought to a head by COVID-19, or as some of us call it, the Wuhan virus. There always was a significant problem for many years in Australia. When I'm giving talks and so on, I often ask people if they can identify a significant problem facing Australia, which, if it weren't created by the politicians, has been made significantly worse by them. And I invariably find that nobody can point to such a problem. Everything seems to be the consequence of this concentration of politicians, not only in Canberra, but in the big state capitals. And they are very much divorced from the people, and even from the membership of their parties, because the parties, to a great extent, have been captured. And I think this is particularly so as people begin to realise that everything is going well concerning the crisis. And I remember at the time of the big lockdown, I pointed out, and it's not as though I'm somebody special and that I have any knowledge about matters concerning epidemics, but it wasn't difficult for me to establish that the politicians, that is the premiers from the big states, they're all big states, the premiers had managed all along to ignore world's best practice. It seemed to me to be very clear that we had all the advantages. We have all the advantages of being a remote island nation, one of the most, next to New Zealand, in the world. Very easy to control entry. And then I looked at a country with a similar population, Taiwan, next door to China, and they've been able to protect the vulnerable. They haven't put their economy into recession. They haven't thrown vast numbers out of work. They haven't wrecked businesses, and they haven't left a massive debt, nor have they had lots of internal barriers to movement around the island. Yet, we've had 50, with a similar population, and not the advantages of isolation as we have, we've had 50 times the number of cases, and we've had 60 times the number of deaths. And Taiwan hasn't had to have a lockdown, and now we're given all the hallmarks of a dictatorship, just like communist East Germany or Stalin's Russia. There's even a near blanket ban on travelling overseas, and internally we've got these internal borders which you used to have in the old Soviet Union. And then we have these people who should know better coming out and saying the problem is this. The problem is we've got to have a republic. And for heaven's sake, we spent so much time, the politicians spent so much time in the 90s on that tired old furphy about becoming a republic, that it wasn't a real republic. What they proposed wasn't a republic as the Americans know it or the Swiss know it, a tried and tested republic. What they proposed was a politicians' republic. It would have been the only one, not only in the world but in history, in which it would have been easier for the chief politician, the prime minister, to sack the president than his cook. It was really quite extraordinary. No one had done anything like this. And despite the fact that most of the politicians jumped on the bandwagon for this fake republic, and the Republican movement had the enormous wealth of Mr. Turnbull and others, and the mainstream media got behind it, it was defeated nationally in every state and 72% of electorates. And just to tell you what sort of republic they had in mind, Paul Keating was really the man who started it all. He got Turnbull interested. But it was really the Keating-Turnbull republic. Back in 2017 at La Trobe University, he told us what sort of government he likes. Referring of all places to communist China, he said, that government of theirs has been the best government in the world in the last 30 years. Well, if you want a centralized one-party government, you've got it there in China. And then these people who are saying the problem in Australia at the moment, and that people are beginning to wake up to the mess the politicians have made. Mainstream media has gone along with the government. Morrison was very clever. Having had a terrible time over the bushfires, particularly when he went off for a holiday in Hawaii, he realised he had to duchess the principal commentators in the media, and they were taken in. And they're not very expensive to duchess the major people in the news media. They were brought into the cabinet room and given a special briefing. And the consequence has been, I think you notice every night on television, what you get are really the rearranged press releases of the government trying to turn the country into a state of fear and panic because there's been a case of somebody who's tested positive going into some little restaurant in some suburb, and this creates a frenzy in the way we didn't create frenzies over, for example, the pandemic over flu, which comes every couple of years, and the SARS epidemic and so on. But not only are they saying, well, it's time for a republic, the other thing they're proposing now is to abolish the states, which is a ridiculous proposition. The Americans who invented the modern concept of federation argued properly that their country was far too large to be run from the centre. And that same argument applies in Australia. We're too geographically large to be run from Canberra. Canberra just wouldn't have any idea about how to run, for example, North Queensland or somewhere in Perth or in Tasmania.
No,
we need governments. Yeah, you need governments close to the people. We've got the most centralised of federations in comparable countries. And you see that with the money. 80% of taxes are collected by Canberra. No other federation comes near that. They hand back about half of what they collect, but they tell the states how to manage it. So they're pushing their noses into affairs which are really affairs for the states. And you get a mess when you have, it's the same as having two drivers in a car, each with their own wheel.
Exactly.
And they make a terrible mess. And the other thing is Canberra can't run its own affairs. Just think of defence and that ridiculous multi-billion-dollar submarine contract. And yet they try to get involved in state affairs. The other serious problem is that not only is there massive centralisation in Canberra, there's massive centralisation in Brisbane and Sydney and Melbourne. It's extraordinary. We're probably the least populated continent in the world, but somehow the politicians have succeeded in massively overcrowding the capitals, especially Sydney, but certainly also Melbourne and now Brisbane. And this has meant that they've become dominant in each of their states, much more so than in any comparable federation. Our capitals have a record half of the state population, as in Queensland, in the capital, and 4/5, as in Western Australia. And this means there are fewer votes and there are fewer seats in the regions. Yet the regions are the ones quite often which are much more financially successful than the capital.
Yes, and
I think Queensland is...
Sorry.
Yeah,
sorry, continue. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Not at all. But I think the case of North Queensland is a classical example of this. North Queensland produces so much in terms of agriculture and other wealth, and Brisbane manages to spend the money. And we really need to look at this. We desperately need new states. And I think the first should be the oldest proposal because, as you all know, North Queensland was on the books at the time of federation. And in fact, that was the reason why the Parliament in Brisbane couldn't agree on how to be represented at the last Constitutional Convention before federation. And I think North Queensland is the classical case of an area which should be a separate state. And people will say, oh, it doesn't have enough, it's not large enough, which is ridiculous. It compares very well with Tasmania, and certainly there are much smaller states in other comparable federations, the United States, Canada, and especially Switzerland, and to an extent in Germany and Austria. The problem, as you will all appreciate, is that while we do have a superb constitution drafted principally by a Queenslander, Sir Samuel Griffith, no constitution is ever perfect. And obviously there had to be concessions. In fact, there was a proposal to set aside the question of setting up the separate states in Queensland and leaving that for the imperial government to settle. But they realised, I think Griffith also made a point on this, that if they did that, Queensland might not join the federation. So the Constitution provides that the Parliament, the Queensland Parliament in the case of North Queensland, would have to approve the setting up of a new state. And they'd obviously have to cooperate in testing this by way of a referendum. It's not clear whether there has to be a referendum also in the rest of the state. One section seems to say that, but when it came to the New England referendum, they only tried it in the part that they were going to allocate to the New England area, although they extended that, as you know. The problem is the Queensland politicians are going to be very difficult to persuade to initiate a referendum. But there may be some good which flows out of the present crisis, because I suspect that when the Australian people wake up to the way they've been misled over this crisis and the complete mess Canberra and the premiers have made of this, the way the premiers, particularly the Queensland Premier and the West Australian Premier, seem to be blocking off state borders just for the purpose of winning elections. I think there's going to be a reaction by the Australian people, and it may well be that is the time where the people will say, we've had enough. It's really time now, if they become aware of this, it's really time now to do what we did, what Australia did so brilliantly just before Federation, and that was on the proposal of Sir John Quick, who our school children know nothing about, but he ought to be a national hero. After Federation failed, because when the Constitution went to the colonial parliaments, they all disagreed with one another and they wouldn't have got anywhere. Quick came up with a brilliant answer: why not hand it back to the people? His proposal was, let the people elect a convention. When the delegates of the convention come to conclusions about the Constitution, they should consult with the people and the politicians. But once they produce their final draft, that then, without the approval of the colonial parliaments, should go straight to the people. And I think we really need now a new corridor plan, and part and parcel of that must be the question of the new states, because I think really we need a number of new states. The situation in Queensland is mirrored in New South Wales. In New South Wales, Sydney is far too large, with nowhere else for immigrants to go to. They all go to Sydney, Melbourne or Brisbane. And the result is we have this highly concentrated city, which has an enormous part of the population of New South Wales. It has 64, almost 65% of the population of New South Wales is in Sydney. So all the votes are in Sydney. Same thing happens in Melbourne and in all of the other capitals.
Certainly the same in
Queensland. Yes, and Queensland used to be celebrated as the least centralised state, but it's become more centralised with what's happening down in the southeast quarter. So my suggestion is, if the Queensland Parliament, the Queensland politicians won't play ball, there may well be an opportunity, if there's a general dissatisfaction because of the complete mess that we're left with over this massive lockdown, where the government has created the most serious recession, perhaps even depression, that the country has known for many decades.
Well, and yes, and David, look, you touched upon many different subjects there, and all of it was rich in both historical content as well as the modern plight in which we are faced with the mishandling or just uncertainty of the times in which we're in. And it comes down to the representation, and the inability for us to be able to actively change the way the government is carrying out its will, definitely in a state like Queensland. And for the dwindling representation in our state currently, which is the main reason people like myself and dare I say Bill, although Bill's very in-depth with many different facets of why we should have a new state, which I learn on a daily basis from everybody, because you start to understand that there's a chicken and an egg scenario, and you just touched upon it with examples of New South Wales. We have examples here in Queensland where at what point is the government actively contributing to the decline of the regions of Central and North Queensland when they remove services because they can justify it by declining population or declining need of services, when it can actively in itself contribute to the decline of the population and interest in wanting to live in the regions due to the lack of services. And I'm sure that's a trait I'm sure that is a problem that's happening Australia-wide, because centralisation of government and the overpopulation of cities, as you outlined, only means that the interest is in the voter in concentrated electorates. And when you get left with a situation like Queensland, where 73 are in a roughly 250 kilometre radius of the south of the Brisbane CBD, you are left to wonder, what are the other 17 or to do? What out of 93? What are 17 seats in Central and North Queensland? That could essentially be the economic powerhouse of ours, or well, already is, but are definitely an economic powerhouse of the whole of the nation. What are we left to do to govern ourselves and actively contribute to our own destiny when it's constant appeasement to the voter of the inner cities of Brisbane and Sydney and Melbourne? And you're definitely one that's an active in support of referendum, and the referendum is no doubt something that should we ever have the opportunity to, that every Central and North Queenslander would actively be very excited of the opportunity to have their voice heard, because it's becoming more and more clear to many people that we're the far off distant cousin that they hate to hear from. And when the current state of things through COVID-19 is a great example, and topical as it is, it's the best example we can use. When we have a situation in Queensland, which I'm sure is the case in many in New South Wales and Victoria, but when we have a knee-jerk reaction from an outbreak in the CBD of Brisbane that creates a fundamental echo throughout the whole of the state, in which people in Bamaga and people in Cairns have to respond to a crisis that might be outbreaking 2,000 kilometres away. It doesn't take a genius to see this is absurd. And although management of health issues like this are nothing but fair for the general safety of the population, it is absurd. And I constantly see these articles popping up about how the humidity and heat is turning out to be very, very detrimental to the longevity of the virus that is exposed to it. And we laugh. We laugh because it's like, not that we ever got an opportunity to prove that right, being forced to lock ourselves down because of an outbreak in Brisbane. And look, you've also touched on the fact that through our federation and the ability for us to be a strong country and the fortunate scenario of us being a continent, there are many things wrong. And the lack of representation that we obviously feel justified in saying is unjust, is something that is echoed throughout the whole of the nation. And you're on paper to be able to say that you think there should be at least another 5 or 7 states, from my recollection, David. Is that correct?
That's true, yes. I think New South Wales could easily be 4, for example. Which would, the Sydney region is virtually a state. It's big enough to be a state, and it would be much better as a state, because they're also draining the regions in New South Wales in a similar way to Queensland. And you get this ridiculous thing during this crisis of a harsh lockdown rule being applied for the purposes of an alleged outbreak in Sydney, but then it applies in some small country town where the little restaurant, the little cafe and the shops there have to suffer the same consequences as is happening in Sydney, which is grotesquely unfair because they've never had an incidence of the virus in their area. So why should they have to? We
had stories breaking that the pubs in central Queensland that have populations of maybe a couple of hundred people were forced to enact, even by the one local copper that community might have had, to not allow patrons to visit the pub, which is generally in small, across Australia, is generally the social meeting point for all of those small communities. They were forced, even though they're distant, they were so distant from where all the action was in regards to COVID-19 and its spread across southeast Queensland, they were forced to enact procedures, if they were even allowed to take patrons at all, to manage any form of danger when it comes to COVID-19. And it's absurd.
I agree. There's another factor too in the structure, and that's that since federation, I believe the political parties have been captured, and more so in recent years. We no longer have a really representative democracy. This is because the power brokers in the principal parties have taken over. They use rigid discipline in the parliaments. For example, if you go and watch Question Time in the federal parliament, it's a caricature of what happens now at Westminster. At Westminster, the Speaker looks up and he asks, are there any questions? And he looks around, are there people standing? And he chooses who's going to speak. In Canberra, the Speaker gets a list. The whips draw up a list. He's told who to call. And, of course, all of the questions from the government, and they get every second question, are all written in the whip's office somewhere in the government. They tell which backbenchers are to ask questions, and the ministers know the questions and have the answers ready. It's a caricature of Question Time. It's something you'd expect more in a quasi-dictatorship.
Well, it's a facade of democracy, country. I would say, yes.
Yes. And then you have this outrage that very few pre-selections now are being done by the members of the party. These are pre-arranged whereby the power brokers select the strongest power broker decides who the candidate will be, and they're chosen not on merit. They're chosen because of their allegiance to the most dominant power broker in that particular part of the electorate. And this means we're getting into Parliament, and New South Wales is probably the worst example. You're getting into Parliament people who will do what they're told, as instructed by power brokers, who often have a financial interest in what is going into Parliament. It is a very poor system, but it means that when the people go to an election, they don't really have a choice. Edmund Burke said, you choose your representatives for their judgment. Well, it doesn't happen in Australia now. The elected representatives go in there and they're directed how to vote. And in particular, this will happen in Brisbane. Queensland doesn't have the luxury of an upper house. So there's no possibility of there being dissenting small parties in the upper house who can sway things differently. So we have in many ways a caricature of a democracy, and I think this is shown up in the so-called national cabinet, where you get all of these premiers and prime minister. I think only perhaps two of them have had real jobs. They've all passed through apprenticeship, going straight from university, or even while they're at the university, apprenticeship in politics, working in, politicians' offices or on the Labour side in unions, and they go in and they become advisors. They're barely out of university and they're already advisors, and they spend most of their time on their mobile phones plotting eventually how to get the safe seat themselves. So we've created this class, this sort of aristocracy who are distant from the rest of us, who think they know better than us, and make a tremendous mess of everything. And naturally in Brisbane and Sydney, there's a determination to keep those regions because they're producing much of the money they need.
Yes. Well, we can be guaranteed, David, that at every discussion, when we ever dream and talk about if one day the future state of North Queensland would be created, that it would most certainly have a lower and upper house. And the bicameral system is one component of why the situation is so dire in Queensland currently and why it needs to be changed. Because we would be sad to see our southern counterparts go, but we would be happy to believe them with their overpopulated city that is only going to have one tier of government should they wish to stay that way. Because in a two-tier government, the regions of Central and North Queensland would have nothing but a bright future ahead of them, both in better representation and, as you say, even the component when we understand that 80% of tax revenue essentially through GST redistribution comes from Canberra, comes from the federal government. The suite of representatives in both the Senate that we would have, our House of Reps would not necessarily increase. I think we would still retain about 5, but the suite of senators that would come our way would greatly increase the chances for us to get those funds, to get access to that pool of money that would greatly allow us to have those big projects like dams, to have those big projects like hydroelectricity to flood the regions with a significantly cheaper electricity, to be able to innovate, to be able to produce, and to generally pay for everybody's whims. And for the government currently to enact draconian policies upon us based on the fact that nothing is actually happening in our regions but happening in a far-off distant corner of the state is just another reason we've entered into. 2020 has been the year of another example for us. And it's getting to the point now where we can see, and we've always made jokes, and I'm sure the New South Welshmen like yourself have always made quips about Victoria. We're getting to the point now where it's scary to make jokes about the Mexican South because it's the Venezuelans below you that we're worried about. Do we want to be in the current state that a place like Victoria has found them in, where if you're out past a certain time of night, the police can arrest you or detain you? It's absurd. And look, I can only see the small pub in Richmond absolutely rolling their eyes if the police officer turned up to try and enact those things. North Queensland, we're different. We think differently, we operate differently, and we believe in things differently than our southern counterparts now do. And the two-tier government is one component of why we're forgotten. And as you say, for somebody that's to become a career politician or a career unionist or a career whatever, straight out of university to become then I'm going to be a politician is only a part of the problem itself. And you've long been a believer in, I believe, just off the top of my head, what you've referred to as the 4Rs, where the restoration of the federation is a component of making the country better, but the reforming of the parties is one of those things. Just quickly, the other two was referendum, I think. Am I correct, David? Was it the 4Rs?
You are absolutely correct. You've studied very well, and the other one was recall elections, which we were promised in New South Wales. At least they promised a serious consideration of it. And when they got the report favouring it, much to their surprise, since they carefully chose the panel, probably thinking that they'd recommend against it. I remember a friend of mine asked the Attorney General, said, well, you promised to do this, you got a favourable report, why aren't you putting it in? And he said, the difference is that we're now in government. Which is a very honest answer, I thought.
You can only give him credit where credit's due for the honest answer. Bill, yeah, did you have a comment to contribute?
I was just thinking, I think recall is a very good proposition, and I reckon if there was ever a case for recall, it would have been in 2000 and when did Abbott get in? About 13, when Oakeshott and Windsor, who was supposed to represent, as independents, were supposed to represent some of the most conservative electorates in Australia, went and joined Gillard and put Labor into government. I mean, that would have been a classical thing for the electors there to ask for a recall on those two characters who basically gave us a Labor government with Gillard. And we should have got rid of him a term earlier.
I agree entirely. That was an appalling thing, and he should have been recalled just for that speech he gave. Remember the speech he gave where he took about 20 minutes to tell us how he was going to vote on whether or not to support the government, and who kept everybody in suspense because he was obviously enjoying it. But I agree with you. We should have recall elections, and we should reform the political parties. That reform of the political parties was...
If I could just go to the Constitution.
Sure.
The Constitution clearly, our founders, they devoted a whole chapter to new states, and I presume a lot of that was in part as a necessity, but also inspired a little bit by what was going on in Queensland at the time, where both Central Queensland and North Queensland were trying to separate and form separate colonies. I think the 1890 petition, basically it came out of Central Queensland for Rockhampton, but it also provided for the creation of the colony of North Queensland. And it was really that petition not going through the motions with the British Parliament was basically because federation was becoming the thing of interest even for the British Parliament, that they were quite happy to sort of let us go and become a sovereign nation, and they didn't really want to hold it up. So that we've got a whole chapter devoted to it. So when we at Brisbane sort of pushing for a separate state, we know we have the protection of the Constitution, that we're doing something lawful. However, I get somewhat agitated with these people like Beattie, Gleeson, and I mean Hawke was the same. He used to throw it around that the state should be abolished, but for all their bravado about let's abolish the states, I haven't seen one active group led by anyone of consequence trying to push that agenda at all. They might make reference to it to stop the conversation about separate new states, but there's no one actively doing it. Peter Beattie is often, he's written I suppose, a short book about it. And I think Hawke wrote a book, or referenced it. But I've never seen them sort of actively engage in making that proposition an outcome. Now, to my way of thinking, just reading, I'm not a lawyer or anything, but the sedition laws, although they seem to be state laws more than federal laws, but to me, to someone to try to undermine a state of the nation, a state of Queensland or the state of Western Australia, that to me seems to be there's no legal coverage for them, and it just seems to be an act of sedition to me. What legality or what basis can they possibly operate to put the proposition across to actually abolish states?
Well, they would argue that they are saying this within the Constitution, that they're proposing that it be done constitutionally, that is through a bill before the federal parliament and then a referendum. But I think you're absolutely right. They're not seriously suggesting this because they know it would never get up. But at the same time, just on the legality of things, what about the politicians who swear allegiance to the Queen in the Constitution, and then as soon as they're out, they come and campaign against the Crown? They say, well, we're proposing this constitutionally, but I think that when you swear an oath, you have an obligation to keep that oath unless circumstances have so changed that you cannot conscientiously keep to that oath.
It's a very fair point, yes.
From that oath.
It's a very fair point. It's all good and well for a lobby group to be able to bring that to the table and say, none of us are elected representatives that have made this oath and we think a republic is a great idea, we should do it, as opposed to ex-representatives that have made that oath pushing for the agenda. That's a very fair point.
There was one British MP who was a Republican who crossed his fingers behind his back. But fortunately, they allow photographs in the House of Commons, so he was photographed crossing his fingers behind his back as he swore the oath of allegiance. And I think if you're going to swear the oath of allegiance, you're going to break that. What about those who go into court and promise to tell the whole truth? Tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Should we treat their oaths similarly? That is of no value.
Well, the one thing we can be certain of, I think, David and Bill and everybody listening, is that I don't think that gentleman was the only politician that would have been caught out with his fingers crossed behind his back. Bill, did you have a thought? Sorry, just then.
Yeah. I just think it's very hypocritical that people who actually been premiers of a state, both Newman and Beattie, actually get there and say that they want to abolish states. I find that how dare you even run as a candidate for a state government if you don't believe in states for a start? And I know that the member for Burnett is also of that position that the state should be abolished. I just find that how dare he sit in the Queensland Parliament and yet in his own mind and vocalises that the state should be abolished.
Exactly. They should be arguing that the states should be returned to their former position, where they had independent income, for example. They're also dependent on the Commonwealth, which goes against the very notion of the states, which is so well set out in the Federalist Papers when the Americans were establishing their republic. I think we need stronger states. We need more of them, and that would be marvelous. And I also think we're talking about House seats. I also think in the House, in the lower house, we become far too obsessed with trying to have equal population. It is ridiculous, for example, to have some of the seats in Western Australia, which are so large, they're almost as big as Europe, well, certainly bigger than many European countries. And you have to have commonality for an electorate, and if there is I think it's more that should be the important thing, rather than that a Sydney electorate should be the same as the next Sydney electorate, whereas there's no commonality because people are commuting to work. They don't have the strong sense of locality that a person in a country electorate has. I think it's ridiculous that a country electorate should be treated as if it's a city electorate and have exactly the same population as, say, Wentworth or one of the Sydney electorates. There should be variations. I see nothing wrong with that, and Queensland did lead in this regard, I remember. Although I was reading a book about Sir Joe Bjelke-Petersen and demonstrated that he never needed the variations, he would have won anyway.
I think although they referred to it as a gerrymander, it wasn't. It was more of a malproportion. And basically the Fitzgerald inquiry and the outcome of that is basically put the situation there that it's got to be a one-man, one-vote system, and I think that's got to, I mean, if anyone takes that to High Court, I think they'll always be able to push that. But that's where a separate state comes into it. If Central and North Queensland, because we push for the idea of a viable state, and to us a viable state, we observe or take notice of people like Professor Bernard Salt, and that you basically a reasonable proposition is you'd want a population critical mass of about 1 million people if you can, and also the way things have changed over the years with the greater population of Australia, you're now in a situation where a population quota for one federal seat is now 175,000 residents. So to get five federal seats, which Tasmania enjoys, we would need to have 875,000 people. So a North Queensland state that we talk about is actually is Central and North Queensland as a single state. If they progress over time and sort of build up their own populations, well, I presume if you push for a separate state, you're willing to sort of look at further separation down the line. But in just Central and North Queensland, if it became a state, the electorates would be more effective in regards to you'd have something like, maybe if you had 25 seats, you would have something like 25,000 people in electorate. Yes, some electorates would be reasonably big, but that wouldn't be a overly bigger problem, because you still would push for having an upper house as well. So by dividing areas into province for the legislative council, you could make sure they're well represented in the upper house. So that's the way I see it in regards to a separate Central and North Queensland state. But the other thing is, additional states, I believe, would make it much more difficult for the carrot and the stick attitude of the federal government. At the moment, it only has to deal with 6 states, and I mean, it's got the territory, Northern Territory and APC. They're only self-administrated territories anyway, so they've pretty well got them under control. But they can easily manipulate the system with their big trough of money that they get. But if we got to a situation where there was 10 or 12 states, I think the federal government would be hard-pressed to use Section 96 it is, to sort of dish out the money to sort of the way they see fit. And I could see that section actually getting repealed by the states over time, or forcing the members from the states pushing that to be repealed. And I think that would be the greatest gift to all Australia if we could get rid of Section 96, where the federal government can sort of give grants to the states as it sees fit.
I agree with you completely on that. I think that it should have been one of those sections in the Constitution which had an
expiry date.
Closing date. What sort of date did you call it?
expiry date.
Yeah, an expiry date on it. It should have been, and it's been so.
Well, actually, if you read it, it sounds like it could have been. The way it was written, it was sort of, it said for the first 10 years or something, and then as it desired. But obviously, there was an intent there that it could be written out after a period of time, and the states could stand on their own feet. Because one of the problems with federation was when we first formed, we had Tasmania and West Australia, very, very small populations and sort of not great economies, But that sort of changed. That all the states are now reasonably self-sufficient, and a central North Queensland state would be a powerhouse. So this Commonwealth no longer has to nursemaid the states that were sort of in that sort of weak position at federation. 120 years has passed. It's time for everyone to stand on their own 2 feet.
Well, I guess this is the point as well. We should mention, gentlemen, and on our sister podcast, Northern Vibe, hosted by Matt Maloney, he had a guest just recently, and they discussed this exact sort of a thing on a national scale as what is required. And his guest made a very, very brilliant point, which resonated with me. As Australians, as we care about each other, and then we are Australians first and foremost, we need to balance that commitment to each other. And the commitment to each other is that I want you to have the best for your community that is available. And currently in the system that we have, where we need to go begging through a referendum or through a hung parliament to be able to dictate that things aren't good, we'd like it to change, the fact that we have to avidly fight and bargain for that, not necessarily bargain, but avidly lobby for that right, for us to be able to be sovereign and make our own decisions, make investments in the sort of things we deem logical investments, and devote the time and resources of our communities into projects that we deem profitable or has significant value. I think that's the thing that it would resonate with everybody across the whole of the nation.
I think that's very true, and I do think that when North Queensland becomes a state, the impact of that when sensible decisions are being made for the development of North Queensland, that will be attractive to immigrants. Now, immigrants essentially go to Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. They don't go to the regions. And young people tend to stay in Sydney and Melbourne. But if you had a new state government doing superb things, developing the area more, you would attract both immigrants and young people, because there would be initially that great advantage that they'd be able to go there and fill the Australian dream. The Australian dream is to live in a house with their family. It's not to live in units on top of one another in Sydney or Melbourne or Brisbane.
Overpriced units of that, David. Overpriced units of that.
Yes, overpriced. And I think it would have a tremendous impact, because it would be so attractive for a young couple, for example. They could go and live in a lovely area in North Queensland and not have to worry about really pledging a vast part of their life to pay for a house worth or costing a couple of $1 million in Sydney, which is ridiculous. And I think that stimulus could only come from having a government which is concerned with that new state and not concerned with doing things in Brisbane.
Well, I guess
I think the big
go.
plus.
Sorry, Bill, go.
I think the big plus for a new state will always be in the initial instance having those 12 senators. Those 12 senators going to bat for your industries in Canberra to make sure that they have as good an advantage as any other the similar industries in other states, to make sure they have the chance of winning contracts and progressing and getting the necessary infrastructure to encourage private enterprise investment is all important. And at the moment we have a situation where you've got central North Queensland is an area of 1.2 million kilometres. Now, we have 3 senators who choose They're not Central and North Queensland senators. They are Queensland senators controlled by their party in Brisbane. However, they choose to live in, one lives in Cairns, one lives in Townsville, and one lives in Rockhampton. But make no mistake about it, they are not representing North and Central Queensland. They might mouth support that they like the idea of North Queensland going ahead and all that sort of stuff, but they are ruled and dictated to by their machinery in Brisbane, and that's the truth of the matter. So we need a separate state where we've got our own senators who are completely obsessed, and that's the word I'd want, and that's the way I'd want them to be describe themselves as obsessed, to make sure the people and residents of Central and North Queensland have every advantage of getting the funding for infrastructure that provides them and future generations with opportunity and prosperity.
Well, I think what you're doing is wonderful. You're keeping this alive. You've got this superb tool here, and the one that Matt has, and your website and your Facebook, keeping it alive in front of the people. And isn't it wonderful that technology gives you these possibilities, whereas once upon a time it would be more difficult. This gives you something which just wasn't available earlier. And I hope that the local media are taking notice of you.
Well, I think the biggest problem with the local media isn't local anymore. I mean, if you go back to the movement in New England for a new state, I think there was a guy called Victor Thompson. He was an editor, I think, in Armidale initially. And I think they had a coalition of 130 independent newspapers in regional New South Wales supporting the idea of a separate state. Unfortunately, those days are gone where basically all we've got left is News Corp newspapers, and just recently we completely lost the printed copies of those newspapers in Bundaberg, Rockhampton, Gladstone and Mackay, and all the smaller regional newspapers further out. So that is a really sad situation we're faced with now, that the local media is almost non-existent, and if anything, parrots the line of their masters down wherever they are. Like in Brisbane, the Courier Mail is sort of probably directing the what's left of the printed media, which is only in Cairns and in Townsville. That's all we've basically got left far as printed media.
And look, that reflects upon one of our listeners' comments just before. Andrew made a comment that centralisation of big business, because his government is just like big business, because big government loves big business, and big business loves big government. And I guess that's a component of that as well, is because if a newspaper was still slightly profitable, but an organisation like News Corp decided to close it nonetheless, you could definitely see a reflection upon how a big government like the Queensland government would reflect and make the same decision. It doesn't necessarily mean that piece of infrastructure or that investment in that local community is neither good nor bad. They just see it as an opportunity to cut their losses, retract, and devote those resources elsewhere. And I think it's a valid point. I think it's part of the reason why Central and North Queensland miss out on so many services and infrastructure, because big government, in this example, the Queensland government, sees the opportunity to appease more southern counterparts, thus where the concentration of electorates is. It's a very bad situation for all of us up here in Central and North Queensland.
I think one of the
interesting things is how, at the same time, small towns, regional towns, inland towns, are gradually withered on the vine because of the lack of infrastructure and growth. The newspapers have sat there and watched this and done nothing, not brought it to the attention enough of the general population, and now they're the victims of the same withering. I think it's quite ironic, really. They're sat there, they're pretty idle for decades now and watched inland towns wither, and now they're the victims of it as well.
David, we have a listener that Matthew Maloney actually, who wanted to ask what your opinion was. This is the question: can you ask Professor David Flint what Quick and Garron say about the section that you were just talking about? I think Bill might have been mentioning something. He said section 97. I think
96.
Yes.
Yeah. What do you think? Yes. What do you think their thoughts would have been, or are? Sorry, if you know from reading about them.
Well, instead of putting in an ending of the section, they do say until the Parliament decides otherwise. That was a time, I think we should remember, when political parties weren't as centralised as they are today. They were really coalitions of people thinking similarly together. It was only when the Labour Party emerged that you got the disciplined party. And the Labour Party introduced the caucus rule, which doesn't even apply in England at the present time. In Britain, they don't have a caucus rule. So you saw, for example, when Tony Blair joined in the invasion of Iraq, there were many Labour MPs who voted against him. They weren't expelled from the Labour Party, and he needed Conservative support in relation to that. But Labour introduced a very rigorous, disciplined political party, which was then finally adopted by the other parties. They claim that you're free in the Liberal Party and the National Party, but I don't think you really are, because they threaten your pre-selection, I gather. But what I think was envisaged by the founders in Section 96 was that the Parliament would sensibly, at some stage, decide that it wasn't a good idea to keep 96 going, but rather than putting it in as a period, and in fact it does stay during a period of 10 years after the establishment of the Commonwealth, and thereafter until the Parliament otherwise provides. You get the impression that they were really thinking that it would probably be needed only for 10 years, but we'll let it go in case we may need it. And you can see with a powerful government, they never want to get rid of that. And when you're in opposition, you know you're going to be in government. Well, and you might want to use Section 96.
Well, the Parliament did see fit to remove one part of Section 7, and that was the division of Queensland into areas for election of senators. So the Hawke government in 1983 decided the Parliament did see fit to decide otherwise and remove that ability for Queensland, although Queensland had never used that provision for 83 years anyway, so obviously hadn't missed it. So, yeah, the government saw fit to remove that. So, yes, we hope the creation of more states will create a situation where there will be pressure on the federal government to remove that Section 96.
The other thing that the new state movement will obviously need to be aware of is that there may be an attempt by Canberra to reduce the number of senators for a new state, because it's the number of senators as the Parliament may determine. So they might try and argue, you're not an original state, therefore you don't get the same number. I think that would be most inequitable, not to have the same number of
I can't wait for the headlines of the news, David, when new state is enacted upon Central and North Queensland through the Commission and through a referendum, whatever the pathway may be. But I can't wait for the justification when they try and tell the people of Australia that aren't aware of the current state of things, that there are currently 12 representatives in the Senate for a tiny little place like Tasmania of 550,000 population. That's not voters, population. And when a state of the extent of Queensland, both in size, of population and square kilometres, has the same amount. I can't wait to see the backlash when people start to wake up to components of the federalist system like that need to be updated.
The other thing is Central and North Queensland not only would have a greater population, it also has something like 12 to 20 times the GDP wealth creation as Tasmania. So I think if the federal government didn't come to the party with the full suite of senators, I think it would be a chuff off to the High Court.
And you'd probably also have that very valuable property, more water than most other states.
Well, yes, and we always have that rogue politician, Bob Cutter, up here, loves to start a speech with it's a universal fact that if you put water on the ground, things will grow. Seems to be one of his favourite things to start a speech on. And it's true up here in Central and North Queensland to the fact. But there's other components that people always forget. And there's hydroelectricity components now when it comes to dams. They're very efficient. They could be high yielding, and it's often forgotten. Now, gentlemen, just to wrap up, I guess that component of when it comes to federalism and the representation when it comes to both the state and the federal state of things, because we have just passed an hour, and we don't want to impose too much upon your evening, Professor David Flint, and we do appreciate you joining us. But I want to finish with I think I've written this down as an exact quote. It's from a notebook of mine from the Developing North Australia White Paper, which was from quite a few years ago. But I dare say, quote unquote, that governments alone cannot develop North Australia. They can only set the right environment for businesses to invest and communities to then flourish. Now, and this is the component where when you have certain areas designated like North Australia, which is encompassing the whole of the continent, when they have certain funds set aside, like the North Australia Investment Fund, set aside to encourage growth and economic opportunity in places like North of Queensland, it only begs the reason that we should try and get the more representatives to access those funds, because as far as I understand, since funds like the North Australia Investment Fund have been enacted, they've made one investment, and that's over a long tenure. Bill, could you remind everyone how long the North Australian Infrastructure Fund has been around now?
2016 was when it was first promulgated, but the only beneficiaries of Northern Australia Infrastructure Fund is the public servants that are actually administering it. I mean, they're probably I think they worked at it at the rate the money's being dispersed. It will take 135 years to expend the $5 billion. So those public servants have got a job for about 2 or 3 lifetimes at least.
Could I recommend to you the piece by Adam Creighton in this morning's Australian about the sort of jobs the public service dreams up?
I'll have to look that up, David, but I'm excited to read up that one. Adam Creighton, did you say?
Yes, the young economist. He's a very good economist.
Well, there you go. I look forward to reading that one. I'm sure it won't be all excitement and smiles and nods. I'm sure it'll be disgust and eye-rolling at some points as well.
Yes, indeed.
Well, like I said, we've surpassed an hour, and we don't want to impose too much on your time. We really do appreciate you taking the time out of your evening to join us, David. It's always a pleasure, and it's good to hear that you're well and things are going okay down there in your part of Sydney and your part of New South Wales. But we hope you stay safe. And Bill, did you have any finishing comments or questions that you'd like to ask Professor David Flint?
No, I'd just like to thank David for his time for coming on, and we hope we have another opportunity to not only hear from him, but to see him again.
Well, I'd be delighted. I was honoured to be invited tonight. I really think this is a very important venture and movement, and I do hope it is soon successful.
I can only hope that some of your colleagues that get on Sky News and sprout on about competitive federalism can somehow find a way to lend their voices to our cause as well. Because I often hear, I think it's Bronwyn Bishop and those on, I think it's Hargraves and that going on about competitive federalism. I'd just like to see some of those more sort of prominent people come to our aid.
I think they failed to understand
Yes,
certain
I
components
agree.
of that competitive federalist notion.
Yes, we need to be much more like the Americans in allowing new states to form. I think that's very important.
Well, I was about to bring that point up just before, and I'm sure one of you two gentlemen might know the exact number, but even though Australia, I mean, America was founded well before Australia was, but even since federation to the point of about 1925, they'd created 20 to 25 new states in America. Is that correct? Correct me if I'm wrong, sorry, gentlemen, if someone knows.
I don't know the number, but I know that they did create I was reading that recently. They
Yeah.
did create a surprising number of states
In
quite quickly.
in that 25-year-odd period, I think it was roughly, I think in the first quarter of the 20th century, I think they did create 20 to 25 new states in America, and it only is another example of, you know what, for all your love or hate of our American counterparts across the Pacific, I think they understood very early on and continued on in their culture of understanding of representation and what it entails and how close it should be as opposed to how far away. And I think it's something we've definitely gone off the rails and we need to fix.
I think one of their advantages was the fact that all the new states were made up of U.S. territories controlled by the federal government, and they were only too happy to offload them. I don't think there's ever been a state in the United States that's been actually a break off of another state, although we are seeing movements at the moment on California. There is a move afoot to break that state up. I think originally they were looking at to break it into 3 sections, the people who are behind it, but I think that's fallen by the wayside, and they're just looking at breaking it in 2, mainly an inland section of rural areas, and leave the coastal section with cities like San Francisco, San Diego, and Los Angeles in the same state, and then basically everyone over the east side of the state in the rural areas form a new state. So that will be an interesting proposition over time. That will be the first time, if it happens, that a state has actually been formed from an existing state in the United States of America.
And I think this is being, they're attempting to achieve this through citizen-initiated referenda, which shows you how you can do it in America. I suppose it means that the whole state would have to agree. The interesting thing I find also about this and new states in America, one of the reasons for the War of Independence, there were 2 other reasons apart from no taxation without representation. The other 2 were slavery. The southern states were outraged by the decision in Somerset's case that slaves were free if they got to England, and they saw that being followed throughout the empire, and the slave owners didn't at all like that. But the third reason was George III's great proclamation, which was to keep the 13 colonies within their boundaries and allocate the rest of the land to the Indians. And they certainly didn't like that.
That would have been a no-growth situation.
No, no wonder things ended up the way that they did. And
yes. Good. Well, thank you very much.
Yes, David,
gentlemen.
David, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I guess we'll wrap things up with that sentiment that we've not only got other regions in Australia to become the 7th state, because there's even a resurgence of the new state movements in places like the New England state movement, but we've got to beat them all. We'll beat California. We'll beat New England. Central and North Queensland will be the next the 7th state of Australia, and we can't wait to have the representation that we deserve and see the brighter and better future for all of us. So, Professor David Flint, thank you very much for your time out of your evening. We really do appreciate it. It is always a pleasure. Regards. Stay safe. I hope you're well, and hopefully we can catch up with you sometime in the future. So thank you.
Good evening, Chairman and gentlemen.
And thank you again, Bill Bates, for also sitting on the panel.
Good night, David and David.
Good night.
D1 and D2. And thank you anyone that might have joined us this evening. My name's David Young from Boot Brisbane signing out. If you'd like to learn more about the campaign to create a new state for Central and North Queensland, you can go to many avenues to learn more. There's the bootbrisbane.com Facebook page where we have constant topical news articles, anything to do with the governance coming from the southeast corner and how it affects Central and North Queensland. Likewise, the sponsor of this evening's channel is Yes to a North Queensland State, who are a sister Facebook page that you can also research and have content of a similar nature. Likewise, if you're interested to listen in on more guests of stature like Professor David Flint of this evening, you can listen in on generally Monday evenings with Matt Maloney on Northern Vibe. So tune into there, and he's also got a Facebook page you can follow also. So good evening, everybody, and stay safe in these uncertain times. And thank you, Professor David Flint, again, and good evening and good night.
Good night.